Hello everybody, recording live from somewhere. This is Zach Couples with episode number 53 of the Movement Debrief. And tonight, ladies and gentlemen, it's going to be straight bars. We're going to talk about rotation versus tilt of the pelvis. What's the difference? You're going to know after today. We're going to talk about Harrison grooves. What the heck is that? What do you do about it? Is there anything you can do about it? Doesn't matter. Stay tuned. And last but not least, we're going to talk about that overhead squat gains. Is that an important test to perform? I will give you the answers tonight in tonight's debrief. Questions asked from the people, answered for the people, by this people, fam, recognized fam. Just coming off a vacation. I'm ready to get after it tonight. Before I do, one quick thing. The Human Matrix. Guys, there's 3 of them. In Seattle, September 15th and 16th. In Kansas City, October 27th and 28th. And in Portland, Oregon, November 10th and 11th. If you haven't signed up, you probably should because spots are filling up. I hope to see you there. Without further ado, let's debrief, shall we? First question, maybe. First question comes from, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly. I apologize. So if I don't, but Weholim, I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Weholim asks, hey Zach, how are you doing? I'm doing well. Just want to ask you about the difference between posterior pelvic rotation and tilt. This is a great question, Weholim. Fortunately, I have a pelvis lying right by me. I can answer this for you. Really, the difference has to do with location, location, location. When we're talking about rotation, or when I'm talking about rotation, I am talking about how the innominate moves on the sacrum. So this is an SI joint movement. So if I anteriorly rotate the innominate, the inlet would flex, abduct, and externally rotate. The outlet would extend, adduct, and internally rotate. Let me say that again. Inlet, flexion, abduction, AB, external rotation. Outlet would extend, adduct, and internally rotate. This combined movement, which happens right here at the SI joint, is rotation. This would be anterior rotation. If I posteriorly rotate the innominate, the mechanics are flip-flopped. Inlet extends, adducts, and internally rotates. The outlet flexes, abducts, and externally rotates. That's rotation. That is different than a posterior pelvic tilt or a pelvic tilt. A pelvic tilt is synonymous with the orientation of this bad boy right here. So if I tilt this forward, I just gave it away. If this whole thing is facing anteriorly or does this would be a tilt. And a tilt can happen not at what happens at the SI joint, but something up higher or within the spinal column. Let me give you an example. Let's say I posteriorly rotate the innominate, just like that. What that's going to do is that's going to open up the infrapubic angle if you're into that kind of thing, which I am. But you have to consider, what happens at the sacrum? If the sacrum, or if the innominate is posteriorly rotated, the sacrum is relatively nutated or flexed. So as I pull this back, the sacrum, which you can't really see, has to come forward. That's normal mechanics. Realize though, that there is not much movement happening at these joints. So what can happen is, if I get sacral nutation and I continue to nutate further by exaggerating the spinal curvature, for example, someone with excessive lumbar lordosis, kyphosis, cervical lordosis, yada, yada, yada. What can happen is I can have this presentation where the innominates are posteriorly rotated, but because the sacrum continues to nutate and the lumbar spine continues to develop a further lordosis, look at that. I have a relative posterior rotation at the SI joint, but the pelvis is tilted anteriorly, or it is oriented anteriorly. That's posterior rotation, pelvis tilted anteriorly. So this has to do with, tilt has to do with what direction is this facing. So a posterior pelvic tilt would be if I move this whole thing back because of an alteration within the spinal column. So the flip-flop of what I just demoed. If I anteriorly rotate the innominate, the sacrum has to be relatively nutated or extended, so it comes back. That's associated with a reduction in the spinal curves. So what happens if I further nutate, or counter-nutate I should say, and I reduce lordosis and all of these things, and this curve's flattened? Well, guess what? Even though the relative action at the SI joint is an anterior rotation, because of what happens within the spinal column, this bad boy right here is relatively posteriorly rotated or posteriorly oriented. So that is the big difference between tilt versus rotation. To summarize, tilt has to do with what direction this whole pelvis is facing. Rotation has to do with what happens at the SI joint proper. And because there is minimal movement at the SI joint, you can have a case where the relative action at that joint is a rotation in one direction, anterior rotation, but a tilt or a orientation in the opposite direction because the spinal column has greater degrees of freedom than the SI joint. So there is a case where I can anteriorly rotate both innominates, but have the pelvis as a whole tilted posteriorly. Great question, we hole M. I know that's a doozy. If that's not clear, please just shout a little comment and I'll see if I can clarify that even further. Next question comes from Tyler. Tyler asks, sup with them Harrison grooves? What do you adjust in your treatment when you encounter these suckers? Well, what is Harrison grooves? That's what we have to answer first. And the definition that I got from Wikipedia, because they say it way more eloquently than I am, and I'll link that in the show notes. I'll even link a picture because it's probably a little bit easier to see. But Harrison's grooves are grooves, gosh, who uses grooves in the definition? But like an indentation along the lower thorax corresponding to the costal insertion of the diaphragm. Straight up from Wikipedia, hashtag EVP, hashtag deal with it. So what that means is at this point where the diaphragm inserts along the rib cage right here, you get an increase in the grooviness, I should say, in the lower portion of the ribs. A lot of times this happens with people who have COPD or kids who have rickets. Take your vitamin C, eat your whatever has vitamin C, oranges and stuff, spinach, all that stuff. That's how this develops though. So if you have someone who has breathing issues or you have a kiddo who is malnourished, chances are you might be developing some Harrison grooves in your future. What do you do about these suckers though, is what Tyler asked. The answer is, I don't care. The treatment is only affected by what angle presentation these individuals have. A lot of times I will say people who do have Harrison grooves are probably a little bit more on the narrow side than not. Just because COPD, you get a further hyperinflation of the lungs, that leads to an inversion in the lower rib cage mechanics, or in the rib cage mechanics, and that could potentially be a contributing factor to Harrison grooves. So even if that is present from an anatomical standpoint, it shouldn't change what you do. The only thing that should change what you do is your testing presentation. If that individual presents as a narrow or a wide infrasternal angle, then you go about that protocol. You're highly unlikely to change anything anatomical, especially that, because that's developed for a lot of other reasons. Just like I don't even know if you can really change posture. It's very tough because there's a lot of factors that go into why an individual may exhibit a particular posture. In fact, how about this? There was a study, and I'll see if I can find it. If not, I'm sorry. That there was an association between scapular depression and actual depression. How wild is that? So if you were depressed, you were more likely to have depressed scapulae. And then depression is also seeing a lot of cool links in the gut. So it's like, is your gut problem causing that? I don't know. Can we alter these things? Does it matter? These are questions I don't have answers to. The best thing you can do for anyone, regardless of their anatomical presentation, is to address the relevant impairments they have that are impeding them from meeting their goals. And if that's from a variability or a variance standpoint, for these people, regardless of how they look, it's the infrasternal angle and all associated tests. If you want to learn more about that, I'll link it in the show notes. Good question, Tyler. I'm sorry I was a little bit anticlimactic, but I just got to reinforce it, fam. You got to trust the test and you should be in business. Last question comes from Lucy. Lucy asks, is there any utility in the overhead squat as an assessment when it comes to figuring out movement limitations at all? Lucy, that's a great question. I'll answer it for you. What is the overhead squat? There's several camps that utilize this, but basically you're standing about hip width apart, arms overhead, you're descending into a squat and you see what happens. The thought from, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's been a while since I've taken the FMS, but the thought from the FMS people is that it's a good way to demonstrate how well you could dissociate those two things, because you're essentially creating an extension pattern in the upper body and you're creating a flexion-based pattern in the lower body. So ideally, it gives you a total appraisal of one's mobility. Also, I believe that NASM uses the overhead squat. I know they definitely do in Fusionetics. We'll dive into those two things. Fusionetics is, and I'll link that in the show notes too, but Fusionetics is an assessment tool that we kind of used when I was in the league. Not the biggest fan, just to tell you my bias. But Lucy's question is very interesting because she asks if it helps us figure out movement limitations at all. And while I think there are some inherent problems in the overhead squat, I think the real problem has to deal with utilizing a gross movement, motor thing. A gross movement to lead to decisions that are really more fine-tuned. For example, someone might not be able to perform an overhead squat, but if you elevate the heels, a lot of times they can go to full depth without issues. You cannot make the assumption that that's an ankle dorsiflexion problem because you eliminated the plantar flexion component. A lot of things changed. The movement context within that changed. Things are different. Now, the FMS actually does a good job of recognizing this, because they're not going to make the claim that because you can squat now with your heels elevated, you need to work on ankle mobility. They will break that out further to make those decisions, and I appreciate that about them. But a thing like Fusionetics or NASM does not do that, and that's where the problem lies. You're taking a huge movement that can have multiple influences as to why it's performed in a particular manner, and then you're trying to make minute extrapolations that you just simply can't. I've seen this multiple times assessing squats the way I do, which is a toe touch to squat and a functional, or like the PRI functional squat. I'll go into those in terms of why I prefer those over the overhead squat. But I remember there was one guy who, as he descended into the squat, he had knee valgus. My initial thought was, maybe this guy doesn't have hip external rotation. He also had an MCL tear on that side. So he was diving into valgus. I thought maybe he didn't have hip external rotation, and maybe he just had a lot of internal rotation and he just pushed too far. Problems. Here's where I was wrong. I put him on the table and I check hip external rotation. It's full. He has 60 degrees. Internal, on the other hand, was 10. So he created the valgus by creating some laxity in his medial collateral ligament. Do you see how and the only reason this was salient for me was because I've seen that compensation so many times that a lot of times that is associated with hip external rotation loss. So I was wrong because I tried to use my eyes to make a clinical decision. And you can't. You have to break these things down into their smallest components to even have a fighting chance of making a change in terms of some of the larger movements. So we can't say that an overhead squat, or any gross movement for that matter, can lead us to make sound clinical decisions or sound movement-based decisions in terms of what we need to focus on versus not. We have to first determine if the basic constituents of movement, having joint range of motion in all planes at all joints, is there. That can only be done on the table. And then we have to move on to grosser tests to see if maybe this is some type of coordination issue, a motor control issue, what have you. I don't utilize the overhead squat. The reason why I don't is because I think there's a couple reasons. First off, any loaded squatting activity, and Daddy-O Pops, I see he's listening, but he turned me on to this. Any loaded squatting activity is going to put the lumbar spine into some degree of flexion or kyphosis. That's normal. When you throw the arms overhead and you create an extension-based pattern in the spine, you have a mismatch in those areas. And perhaps someone who's achieving good depth with that, even though you're going against, you're doing some funky mechanics when you're performing that squatting action, might not necessarily be a good thing. Maybe they develop laxity in their hips to be able to attain that depth, or maybe they've developed laxity in the pelvic floor or somewhere else. So it doesn't necessarily mean that this is a good thing if you could squat to that full depth. I don't like it because it negatively impacts the mechanics within the spine when you're assessing that. That's one piece. The second piece, what does the overhead squat test transfer to? Bill, again, in one of the talks that I attended from him, and I wish I had the picture, but he showed this one gentleman that he was working with doing an overhead squat. And in the very next slide, he showed that same gentleman in Olympic lifting shoes performing an incredible snatch with perfect technique and a substantial amount of weight. If you only saw his overhead squat test, you would reason to believe that I probably wouldn't snatch this guy because he probably doesn't have the requisite mobility or stability to be able to do that. But if you change the context into something that is meaningful for him and familiar, you might get a completely different outcome. So we have to ask ourselves, what does any gross test that we do transfer to? And this is probably why I've been getting away from a lot of those types of tests. I don't do a lot of the SFMA top tier tests unless I need to find something to reproduce someone's pain because I need to make that meaningful for them. If I can change this particular movement that hurts, then we're in business. But I think what's most important is finding the particular movements that an individual struggles with, whether it's pain, whether it's they can't achieve a particular depth, and use those as your testing markers. Not as a way to make clinical decisions, because you're going to do that from a basic movement standpoint, and then you're going to try to coach those movements more effectively once you have the foundation in place. If you do that, then you get activities that are meaningful for the clients, you're going to get better buy-in, and you're arguably going to get much better transfer because this is something that they're going to be doing on a regular basis. An overhead squat, probably not. I do think looking at a squat pattern is important though. That's why I like the toe touch to the squat. This gives me an appraisal for how well that individual can flex as a whole, but it really doesn't lead me to make any specific decisions. What it only tells me is that if this person can't achieve depth, I'm going to do things that restore movement variability and variance, and then I'm going to help them squat more effectively by working a squat pattern. And that's really all that I get, is I want to see how low they can go, and that gives me some insights along with some of the variance-based testing or variability-based testing that I do to make good decisions for that individual. So to summarize, I don't use the overhead squat. You can't utilize gross movements to make fine movement decisions. So places like a Fusionetics, no bueno. FMS does a better job. The problem with this is we have to ask ourselves, how well does this particular test transfer to tasks that are meaningful for the people we work with, i.e. things that are loaded or things that are high performance. And I question how well that happens with any gross test for that matter. What we should be doing instead is giving them that movement foundation and then finding as many ways as possible to help bridge the gap between their terminal tasks that they're trying to do Whether that's a snatch, whether that's playing basketball at a high level, we need to bridge that gap as many ways as possible. Focus on improving that terminal endpoint and helping our people meet their goals that way. Lucy, phenomenal question. I think that that's a good stopping point for us tonight. Thank you all so much for tuning in. It's good to be back. I'm ready to keep this going and get after it. If you want to learn more, here's where you can find me. First, go to zachcouples.com. You want to sign up for my newsletter. Guys, there are 3 freaking talks available there. We're talking about 4.5 hours of content. Can you beat that? We're talking 50 pages of notes. We're talking a free, yes free, acute to chronic workload calculator and an email from me every Friday about cool things I'm learning about. That's what's on docket. If you go to zachcouples.com, you sign up for the newsletter. You also want to sign up for some services. Maybe you want to work with me a little more in depth. Maybe you want to get to know me because I want to get to know you. From a movement standpoint, if you're toyed or maybe you're not moving as well as you'd like to, maybe you're not getting squat done, maybe your overhead squat stinks and you want to say, hey, maybe I want to try this other type of squat. I can help you with that. Hit me up there. If you want to go more in depth with some of the things we talked about today, like how can I apply some of this base testing that you're, Crowbar, you're definitely right about music tips. How can we go into some of this base testing that you're talking about so we can build that movement foundation for our people? I can help you with that from a mentoring standpoint. Hit me up there. Or maybe you want straight gains. Then we do online training. I can write you up a program monthly. We'll do an online consultation so we can address that foundation that I've been talking about, help you reach your performance goals. If you don't like looking at me, I don't blame you. There's 52 other debriefs. You probably want to listen to them. 2 places, iTunes or Stitcher. Sign up to the podcast. I also do some podcasts occasionally. I think you'll love it. Please leave a review so we can bring other people into this realm and have more fam. Other than that, if you want to find me on social media, go to Facebook /ZCouples. I'm on Twitter. The handle is @ZCouples. And of course, I'm on that Instagram, baby. Zach, Z-A-C, Couples, C-U-P-P-L-E-S. Last but not least, search me on YouTube. There's tons of exercises at your disposal that I'm sure you will love. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your week. Keep it real, but not to the extent where things go wrong. Stay hungry, stay learning, stay moving. And I'll see you next time. Deuces.